Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Hello, and thank you for downloading this episode of Sport in Focus on Wisp Sports. I'm Chris Stafford, and our Sport in Focus on this episode is boxing. I'm going to be talking to Malissa Smith, who is the author of A History of Women's Boxing, which is about to release a second edition of the book to coincide with the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. Malissa speaks and writes frequently on the topic of women's boxing. She's a practitioner of the sport itself, been an avid boxer now for many years, and she has a keen understanding of the demands of the sweet science on the women who contest the sport, as she puts it, as well as the challenges they face. Malissa, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you, Chris. This is wonderful.
Well, this is timely, of course. The World Boxing Championships for Women are taking place now, currently in Ulan-Ude in Buryatia, in eastern Siberia, if anybody's wondering where that is. It's about as far away as you can get. The men's World Championships were also in Russia recently, but this is even further east, north of Mongolia it is. I wonder, Malissa, why do they choose such remote areas for World Championships?
Well, you know, in part it's because AIBA, which is the international umbrella organization for the elite amateur fighting, looks to be representative of all countries and areas in the world. There have been world championships in China as well as world championships in the United States. So this time, Eastern Siberia actually won the lottery there. But it's an opportunity for the amateur fighters from different regions to sort of not only show their prowess and fight an international elite platform, but also to really acknowledge that, especially for women's boxing, that this is something that it's a worldwide phenomenon and there's a worldwide really supporting these athletes and if you will, raising the bar of the types of contests that we're going to see. This is also the lead up to what will be the 2020 Olympics, which will be the third time that women will contest in boxing. And for the first time, they will actually box with 5 weight classes. The first 2 in 2012 and in 2016 were with 3 weight classes. So these particular fights are very, very exciting because they will help set the stage for the Olympic trials that will come in early 2020.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you wrote, of course, A History of Women's Boxing, and we want to look a little bit more into that and the history because it is such a deep history in women's. It just goes back much further than a lot of people would imagine, I'm sure. But you mentioned the AIBA there, the governing body of boxing, and we should, just to bring everybody up to date, explain that the boxing, the governance of the sport, is going through something of a turmoil now, Malissa. There's political infighting and something of a reputation to preserve here, and in order for boxing to stay in the Olympic movement even next year. Now we've heard that it is guaranteed to stay in the Olympic movement for the moment, despite this turmoil. How do you see this unfolding now for the future of boxing?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the countries that have put a great investment in both their male and female boxing teams need to really exert pressure on AIBA and on the Olympic Committee to come up with a better plan for governance of this organization to save it. I mean, boxing is a sport that has been contested in the Olympics since the beginning of the Olympics in Greece. So it's not as if you can just walk away from boxing as a sport. It embodies the meaning of what the Olympics are all about. So as you say, there have been tremendous issues with AIBA. with all sorts of concerns regarding their independence, regarding their financial integrity, and so on. So again, it's probably best if leader organizations at the country level come together along with the Olympics to put in a better plan for governments so that we're able to save the elite boxing, if you will, elite amateur boxing, which not only is important for the sport itself, but also helps to train those fighters who want to go on into professional careers. So it's certainly in everyone's interest to take a stand and help ensure the continuity of boxing at this elite amateur level internationally.
Absolutely. Well, the whole integrity of the sport is at stake here, so hopefully it gets resolved amicably in time for the Tokyo Games this time next year, next September. So let's take a look back at the history. First of all, I want to look at your history in the sport. Now, tell us your story. How did you come about boxing? Because you're from New York. You're a New Yorker through and through, you told me. So tell us your story, how you got involved in the sport.
Well, I grew up during the era of Muhammad Ali, and I was a boxing fan as a small kid and used to watch boxing on television with my family. And then when I was a young girl, my uncle was giving my brother boxing lessons, and then I kind of chiped in and said, well, will you teach me how to throw, the old 1-2? And he did. And for many years, I felt so proud of myself that I knew how to turn a jab and follow it up with a straight right, being an orthodox fighter. What didn't occur to me was that I could actually contest in the sport. And that took literally many generations or many decades for me to understand that I could actually do that. So in the 1990s, I walked into a boxing gym and have been training ever since. I've never been a real amateur fighter or anything, but I am what I call a very happy Saturday boxer that takes it pretty seriously. But out of that experience, I got to know female fighters. I box at the world famous Gleason's gym in Brooklyn. It's the oldest continuous gym in the United States at this point, having been started in the 1930s. And by meeting women in the sport, I really became very, very interested in it from the perspective of how long they had been in the sport and what that history really looked like. So I began an academic project where I looked at women's boxing from the standpoint of normative gender behavior, if you will. And out of that, I was offered an opportunity to actually write a history of the sport, since until my book was published in 2014, none has existed. And in looking at that project and looking at the deep and rich history that had never been mined, it was really my honor to be able to start to tease out what that history looked like. Also, from the lens of knowing that there were women who were boxing today, both as amateurs and as professionals, that really had no idea of the richness of that history or of the fact that there were women who were contesting in the sport at a fairly high level a generation before. They had never even knew that they were fighters, for instance, who boxed their hearts out in the 1970s, or women who didn't know the role that a fighter like Jane Couch had in legalizing boxing in England, even though they were boxing 10 years later in the United States. So I really took it on as a labor of love, if you will, to be able to give women a history of their own, if you will, within the sport of boxing, and to show that this sport has had a deep impact not only on individual women who are fighters, but also on the culture at large in terms of breaking down gender barriers and the place that boxing has had in affecting those kind of changes in perception, things that women in the sport still need to contend with as they cross the velvet ropes into the ring. Well,
it may surprise a lot of our listeners, the history of women in boxing. And I was very surprised that it went back in this country to the late 19th century there when two variety dancers, of all people, variety dancers actually fought for the pricely sum of $200, and they also won a silver-plated butter dish for their efforts. So why variety dancers then? What kind of women were we looking at that first decided to step into the ring? I mean, because you wouldn't think variety dancers would be fighters necessarily.
Well, in terms of the late 19th century and really starting in the 1870s, you had men and women who worked, in variety theater. I mean, there were no movies or anything like that, sort of the precursor to vaudeville. And some of the things that would occur on the stage were not just music or dramatic readings, but also physical culture began to be an important part of the variety theater movement. And usually that would be things like people showing their prowess lifting weights or sword fighting or mock sword fighting. And eventually it started to be mock boxing drills. And in the United States, this started in sort of the mid 1870s. And there was actually a couple that would come on stage and they would do sword fighting, and then they would start to do mock boxing. She would then, the wife would then run around the stage and doing what was then called pedestrianism, but really what we call today is jogging. And these were all quite shocking things, but in a theatrical environment, it was something that both men and women could enjoy. So as to why women were contesting as variety dancers, it was a way of expanding their act. And when boxing began to be popular in the late 1870s and early 1880s in various variety theater venues, women would say, well, that's a way to earn a living. So they learned how to, the basics of the sweet science. They also learned how to use speed bags or punch bags, as they were called, and would do acts that would have them doing punch bags, and then they would have a mock fight for 2 or 3 rounds on the stage, and often would then invite anyone in the audience to come on stage to box with them. And if they won, they would win some big amount of money, like $25, or in the British side, which in England, where this also began to occur, they would be offered £25, which was a pretty large amount of money. And as I said, it became quite popular. In the United States, by the 1890s, women were putting on these variety shows all across the United States in large venues and small venues. And out of that began to do what we could call smoker fights, which were not exactly legal. But in small clubs, they would fight other women and sometimes men in 4-round bouts, sometimes all the way up to 10 or 12 rounds. Some with bare knuckles and some wearing very light gloves. But it was really these women who were trying to earn a living, mostly working class women who were plying the boards of the stage, and just added an additional skill, if you will, to their repertoire so they could be employed. There were women who were singers, women who were dancers, women who would do other types of physical culture acts. There was something with dumbbells that they would do, and it was just a way to earn a living.
Well, I was going to come to the class system here, and you touched on it there, that these were working class women there, Malissa. Is this, and does it continue to be, a sport that appeals to certain classes of people?
Well, actually, no. Interestingly, in the United States, my research showed that women of all classes began to be attracted to boxing as a form of exercise. And in fact, there were special types of gloves that were developed. They were called pneumatic gloves. And so basically it was a boxing glove that had an air system that would pump it up so you wouldn't get particularly hurt when one was hit with it. And these were sold to more upper class women who would sort of in the movement, if you will, in the late 1800s was towards this concept of the new woman, sort of eschewing the Victorian concept of women as delicate flowers and bringing in this concept of the new woman who was able not only to be self-sustaining, but able to be strong physically. And there were certain sports that were very much encouraged and allowed, such as swimming and golf and tennis. Boxing was very much at the outer edge of that. But for about a good 10 to 15 year period of time, I would say through the 1890s all the way into the early 1900s, this was an acceptable form of exercise for more upper class women. In terms of contesting the sport, at that period of time, we would certainly not have expected a woman from the upper classes to actually be a fighter. But they were, however, being engaged as spectators at boxing events, and they would, especially as we get into the period of World War I, they would raise funds by supporting boxing matches as a way of supporting, soldiers, and right directly after the war as a way of supporting veterans. One interesting little tidbit is that during the war, and I actually came across this advertisement in a British paper in Liverpool, there was a fight that was being publicized between two women. And what was really wonderful about this ad was that it said, well, our boys are overseas, so let's support these women as an act of patriotism who have are stepping into the ring while our boys are off fighting. So it was a very, very interesting little bit, but it also spoke to how something that had always been very much associated with as a masculine sport was being allowed to have a little bit of a carve out during a period where men were not able to contest the sport because they were off fighting in a war.
I understand it being a good exercise, sparring, and for the reasons you said, some of the women way back then took it up as a form of exercise. I mean, how do you feel as a boxer when you knock that person out or you physically hurt them? How does that make you feel?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think, it's a little bit different from women, I believe, than men. And I think for women, it's almost like a contest with themselves. For women to really break free physically, especially in a sport as seemingly brutal as boxing, it's quite a psychological effort. So I think in part it has to do with contesting against oneself. How able is one to really learn the skills necessary to be able to play this game in the middle of a ring. And it is, after all, it's a sport, it's a game. And one is trying to not only have one's way physically, but there's also the mental aspects of it, to try to break down the other person so that one can become the winner of that contest. And I think it's a very thrilling feeling to win. I know when I spar and I get someone square on their nose, I feel very excited. It's like, oh, wow, I actually got through their defenses.
That's like a bullseye to you then, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. It's like, whoa. Yes, exactly. It's a little bit like that. And, women are competitive just as men are competitive. So there's a competitive aspect to it. I don't think anyone ultimately really wants to hurt someone. And it's not a sense of anger either. And I think that needs to be clearly understood. And especially when you see women fighting, there's always this really genuine embrace at the end, because they know they've both fighters have given their all into that contest. And whoever won or lost, there may be some feelings about it, but ultimately there's tremendous respect for the other opponent who has come in and put themselves on the line and given their heart and soul to that opportunity. So I think for women, it has to do with asserting one's own sense of power and one's own ability to really demonstrate one's own strength. And it's not so much, certainly it is about winning. People love to win. Who doesn't want to win? But it's also often, it's an exercise of fighting with oneself, against oneself, in terms of what skills one is able to bring into the ring, how one is able to read what the other fighter is going to do, how one is going to be able to figure out what that other opponent's defenses are and offensive capabilities are to win. And that's a very thrilling and very exciting process. And it's also, frankly, no fun to get hit. So staying out of the way and being able to defend oneself in a way that keeps oneself safe is also a very thrilling part of that contest.
I'd imagine that's part of the dance, of course. And you mentioned Jane Couch, who was, of course, history maker in the sport. And there are others, of course, like Clarissa Shields, I can think of. And you mentioned Muhammad Ali. Of course, his daughter Lala has also made her name in the sport. And the only actually connection when I think about it to boxing that I have is that I held his hand once. I met him in Sydney prior to the Sydney Olympics at a press event, and he was suffering from Parkinson's then. His wife was with him, and as he walked past me, he held my hand for a few moments, which I suppose was historic, because not everybody gets to hold Muhammad Ali's hand.
That is true. But you raised something very interesting and important, which is that he did have Parkinson's. It was as a result of boxing. And, one of the issues that men and women contend with in the sport is safety and are the long-term effects of getting hit in the head. We see it in other sports, such as football. Now there's where you have all of these mini concussions happening all the time and then causing very serious long-term neurological effects. We are having these issues with boxing, and as women fight in the sport, we're starting to see women who are exhibiting neurological issues after years of contesting the sport as amateurs and as professionals. So part of the calculus of being a fighter is also understanding how much punishment one can take. And for many of these women who are, who view boxing as a way out of their situations, it's a very difficult calculus to make, because they're not able to really earn much money in the sport. And so they do it for the love of the sport, but it has a very high cost. So how that will play out over the next 20 or 30 years as we see these women retire will be very interesting.
Yes, it is indeed. And the history is so rich. Obviously, clearly your book has spelled out the history of women in the sport, and it's a fabulous read, A History of Women's Boxing, which is available on Amazon and going into a reprint, I understand.
Yes. We're going to do a second edition coming out to coincide with the 2020 Olympics. Because so much has happened in the sport just in the last 5 years, we felt it would be a terrific idea to kind of update the book to really tease out what some of these big changes have been and what they mean to the future of the sport. You had mentioned Clarissa Shields. She is a two-time gold medalist in the Olympics and is now contesting at a very high level as a professional boxer. She is now the undisputed middleweight champion and will be boxing actually coming up very soon for another title in another weight class. This does have historic implications in that she is the main event on one of the very big boxing networks in the United States, Showtime Boxing. So the commitment that executives at Showtime and at other outlets for boxing are starting to show women again after about a 20-year hiatus is really very meaningful and is changing the sport, in that there's this recognition that pay equity is important, and that the fans who really enjoy watching these contests are having the opportunity to vote with their viewership to show that this is a sport that's worth supporting over time.
Yeah, well, obviously, as I said, the history is rich, and we couldn't possibly cover it in a 20-minute podcast. But if you are interested in the sport, I do recommend that you read Melissa's book. If you had to summarize the evolution of women in the sport of boxing, Melissa, how would you do that? Give us some final thoughts.
Well, I would say probably since the post-World War II era is where we've seen the greatest evolution of the sport into something that's recognizable in terms of women's abilities to not only learn, have the skills necessary to contest it, but also being in societies that are more accepting of seeing them in the ring and supporting them. Probably the biggest shift started in the 1970s, at least in the United States, where the women's movement had a tremendous effect on women in all walks of life, but in particular in the sports arena. Women took to the courts to win the right to fight, or the right to do many things, but in particular, in terms of professional boxing, they won the right to box professionally by using the court system and equal rights opportunity, civil rights and equal rights opportunities that were available to them both at the federal and the state level. That opened the doorway to provide a legal framework for women to box, even though in the United States it wasn't legalized from an amateur perspective until the mid-1990s. But having that framework in place has now allowed women to understand that they have the right to do this, and as such, as they see their sisters and in the ring, they are excited by that opportunity and feel the permission to give them, or they give themselves now permission to think about boxing as an alternative sports effort and a viable option for them to develop their prowess in a particular sport in an expert way. So that's been, to me, the biggest shift. It ebbs and flows because of where the culture is in acceptance of how women perform sports, what they look like doing it, has had tremendous effects, as you know, across in other sports. Just things like whether or not women wear skirts or shorts in a ring has had its moment of inflamed discussion, such as just as in other sports. But for boxing, for women to be able to contest themselves in boxing, I think the long arc really from the changes in the perception of who women are and who they are to society, from a cultural perspective and from the concept of what it means to be a gender, has really evolved, and boxing is a remarkable bellwether of what that evolution has looked like.
Yes, very true. It certainly has a place in women's history in sport generally. Well, Melissa, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing this with us. There's a lot more to it, obviously, as I said, and you can read that in A History of Women's Boxing by Malissa Smith. Melissa, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Naya Tapper, a proud WISP ambassador and a USA women's rugby player. I support WISP because they give a platform for women in sports to share their stories, celebrate the accomplishments of other women, and to empower the world through sport. I think it's important to turn up the volume on women's sports because women are amazing, they are unstoppable, and they are capable of any and everything, and the world needs to know that. My name's Naya Tapper. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Naya Tapper, Nayatapper. Thanks for listening and supporting WISP.
And if you hop over to our website at wisports.com and click on the Listen tab to drop down to Sport in Focus, that's where you'll find the show notes accompanying this episode with links to where you can actually purchase a history of women's boxing. And as always, we love you to join in the conversation by following us and sharing on social media at WISP Sports. You can also drop us a line to info@wisports.com if you have any suggestions for guests or topics around the world of women's sports. We would love to hear from you. And you can catch up with the weekly news from around the world of women's sports by joining me and Nancy Gillen on the weekly WISP Sports Desk. That's live on your Podbean app every Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern. And again, that is on the Podbean app, where you can actually call into the show too. Until the next time, thank you for listening and helping us to turn up the volume on women's sport.